Hey, what's up, guys? Glad to be back here with you today. So I wanted to talk really quick about the concept of sort of the greatest team of all time and some of the things that we can think about when we're trying to establish what type of team that is. Now, I know that what I'm talking about here has been written about ad nauseum by a lot of people, including a little bit by myself if you actually read the blog. I figure, though, that a lot of you probably are not really reading what it is that I write. My feeling is that my blog audience might be somewhat different from my YouTube audience. And it's an interesting thing to talk about and to sort of think about. It's a sort of debate that very few people, I think, on YouTube really have. But it's a debate that goes back decades and has a lot of people talking about it, right? There's a lot of facets in terms of thinking about, like, what team is the greatest team of all time and what team belongs in the discussion of the greatest team of all time. And it's interesting because even though we have all of these advanced statistics around with us today, even though we have like a whole ton of different ways of looking at run productivity, run production, how to prevent runs, we have a bunch of theories about like what pitchers can affect, what they can't affect, and all this other stuff. And I mean, the stuff that people have written about on fielding takes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages and gives you a headache when you try to read it. Even though we have this type of culture around, the truth of the matter is that when it comes to team effort and team greatness, we still mostly look at the won-loss record, which is kind of an issue because it's not necessarily the best thing for us to look at. But what is the best thing for us to look at? Is there something better? So I'm referring back, if you've looked at the blog, and I'm assuming again that you haven't, there's a really old thread that I remember reading on Baseball Think Factory back in 2006. This is before I was married, right? Gives you an idea of how old I am. 2006 was almost 20 years ago. So yeah, don't tell my children who think that was like ancient history. This thread was one of my favorite threads out of all of the threads that I visited on that message board. Went about 1,400 pages or so, and it was all part of a project to try to figure out who to put in a theoretical Diamond Mine Baseball simulation league to look at the greatest team of all time. Now, as is often the case for projects like this, it's not so much about the destination, it's really about the journey. And so for this one, the real interesting part is not necessarily what happened in the simulation. Here's a hint. It didn't work so well because there were issues with the game engine. Surprise, surprise. But the discussion that people had and the criteria that people said was very, very interesting. And so I'm going to have in the future a number of blog posts that look into some of the specific criteria points that are made, and these posts will hopefully be able to make some sense out of what otherwise is a whole bunch of people talking over each other for 1,400 posts. It's a lot of fun to read, let me tell you. Yeah. Anyway, and we'll talk about some things that are very, very specific to this debate that are otherwise lost. And the first thing I want to talk about is really the first thing I think that comes to everybody's mind. I mean, even more so than the question of, well, won-loss record, yeah, but what was the competition like? And I mean, if there's no pennant race, like, are you really trying in September? Do those games really count and stuff? More important than that is the question about the postseason. Does the postseason count or not when we're looking at this? Now, most baseball stat heads will tell you the postseason is a crapshoot. They'll say that, the postseason has nothing to do with the regular season. In the regular season, you got to worry about your pitching rotation. You got to make sure that guys are gaining game time. You got to platoon. You got to have guys go in and out. You need to have a good bench. You need to have a bunch of guys who are probably just about a starter level who can come in at a good situation. You still want to avoid situations like, it's famous, Mets of the late 80s with Mookie Wilson and Lenny Dykstra, who both should have been center fielders playing on the same team at the same time, right around the same age. Dykstra's a little bit younger. You want to avoid that because you want to make sure your guys are happy, right? I mean, I've played enough Football Manager to know that team cohesion matters, and if you haven't played Football Manager, you should. Check out my other channel. Anyway, going back to this, the question is, does the postseason really count? And now this will always come up because of two teams, right? The most important two teams that will show that the postseason maybe should count or maybe shouldn't count are the 2001 Mariners and the 1906 Cubs, right? Because the 2001 Mariners were a great team that won 116 games in the regular season, but they almost lost to the Indians in the first round of the playoff. I know because I'm a Mariners fan. I remember watching this series, and holy cow. And then they lost to the Yankees in 5 in the second round, right? And they didn't look particularly good in any of these games, and they didn't look good against the Indians, right? It was not much fun. The other team, of course, is the 1906 Cubs, who won 116 games in the National League. that year, but lost to the White Sox 4-2. And the question is, okay, so does postseason failure hurt the team or not? Do we just ignore it or do we think about it a lot? Now, this thread originated on a New York Yankees themed part of Baseball Think Factory. They called it Count the Rings. What a great name. Over on Count the Rings, when they look at this, of course they say the postseason matters, right? Because the Yankees always win it anyway. At least that's what a lot of people feel. Not really true today if you look at the actual history, but that's another topic. And, so because of that, it's really, really tricky. It's really, really tricky to say whether that postseason should count for extra or whether it shouldn't count for extra, And so that brings up this long, long discussion. There are two teams that we can talk about in particular who will tell us whether the postseason will really matter or not. Right, the first one, the first postseason to talk about is the 1960 World Series. You know this one. This is the one where the Pittsburgh Pirates got absolutely blown out by the New York Yankees in the first 6 games and won Game 7 10-9 to win the series. After 7 games, the Yankees outscored the Pirates 55-27. I mean, it was not even close, right? The Pirates won Game 1 6-4. They won Game 4 3-2, and Game 5 5-2. And then the final game they won by 1 10-9. The Yankees in their victories won by 16-3, 10-0, and 12-0. So if you're looking at this from the baseball dynasty's point of view, from the Rob Nair, Eddie Epstein point of view, and I know that book is like almost 25 years old, whatever, we're talking about it because nobody's come out with anything since, right? If you're looking at it from their point of view, you're going to be like, well, this Yankee team looks awesome, right? Because look at all these runs scored and look at all these runs prevented, right? But they lost the World Series. So that will tell you, in theory, that the postseason is just a crapshoot. It doesn't really matter, right? The Pirates were not so good in 59. They were not so good in 61, right? It was kind of a blip, and they were able to barely win the series, That's kind of what that article is, what that argument is, that, hey, don't worry so much about the postseason. It's fine. The argument on the other side is the argument that the postseason might tell you more about a team's weaknesses than you think. This one revolves around another team that won quite a bit, the 1954 Indians, who won 111 games, and then went to the World Series and got swept by the Giants in 4 straight, right? A lot of people would include the 54 Indians on lists of the greatest teams of all time, but there's a problem with this team. If you go over to Baseball Reference, you look up the 1954 Indians, and you click on the thing on their schedule that says their record against individual teams, you'll notice something odd. They went 19-3 against Baltimore, 20-2 against Boston. They went 18-4 against the Athletics and 18-4 against the Senators. So they creamed all of these teams that were under 500. Oh, and then when they played against Detroit, they went 14-8. Right, so they did excellent against all of the teams that were poor. The Tigers and the Red Sox were about the same place in the standings that year. So, I mean, the Indians destroyed Boston, and they just sort of squeaked by against the Tigers. Against the 2 other teams in the American League that had winning records in 1954, the Indians only played 500 baseball. They were 11-11 against the White Sox and then 11-11 against the Yankees. Those of you who are good baseball historians, know your trivia, will know that of all the Yankees teams in the 1950s, it's the 1954 team that won the most games, and they still wound up like 10 games or whatever behind the Indians because the Indians won so many. But the reason why the Indians won so many is not because they were necessarily an all-time great team, but rather it's because they were able to play against the Red Sox, the Athletics, and the Senators, and the Orioles when those teams were playing very poorly. And they were able to capitalize on the fact that those teams were playing poorly. If you remember, I don't remember if I did a video on this or not, but if you go back in my blog and look, you'll see that I wrote something similar about the 2022 Dodgers. And the question is, was this team an all-time great team or not? I mean, it's hard to say, right? Yes, in terms of number of games won, but the schedule is imbalanced. That's the problem. With an imbalanced schedule, it's really hard for us to say that this team was even the best team in the National League. And so when they go to the postseason, they get beaten by the Padres in the first round of the playoffs. I mean, maybe this is exposing the team for how weak they were, right? It's possible that we could say, oh, small sample size postseason means nothing. It's also possible that we could look at this and say, yeah, this team actually wasn't that good. There were a lot of big holes in the team, and that's why they lost, right? There are other things that come into question, too, that we'll talk about a little bit later, stuff like, injuries and streaks and all that other stuff, September call-ups and all that other stuff. Just a little bit there, though, to sort of weigh your appetite. I'd love to know what your opinion is in this debate. right? It's interesting because there are a lot of teams that we might consider to be good teams on paper, but we would never consider to be a great team. The funny thing is that this whole discussion that goes back to really early 2006 started over a preview of the 2006 New York Yankees. 2006 New York Yankees were not an all-time great team. Nobody will make that argument. I've never heard that argument, even though this team won a lot of games and finished in first place in the AL East, 97-65 record, and scored a very, very large number of runs, 930 to be exact, and were able to some extent, really dominate the American League that year. They had an excellent lineup. It's the pitching that wasn't all that great, right? Even though they had Randy Johnson for at least a part of the year, they also had Mike Mussina. Both of them were fairly good, and they had Wang Jianming, who I know a lot because my wife is from Taiwan. There you go. Anyway, so there's a little bit of thought about that, about the 2006 Yankees and these other teams, right? You can have teams that look pretty good, and maybe they're not one of the best of all time, and usually we'll remember the all-time great teams or the poor teams based on what? Based on the regular season won-loss record and based on what they did in the postseason, right? It's interesting. No matter how you look at it, when you go through baseball history, you'll come across all sorts of teams that look pretty good because of this or look good because of that and just couldn't get it done. And you'll start wondering the same thing too. Anyway, a lot more of this to come because we have a lot more to talk about here, a lot of interesting stuff. And I will see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.